And my name is Peter Young, and I am a member of the Committee 100, and I happen to be chair of this Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative. This is actually the 7th event that we've had since the beginning of February, and I'm very, very pleased that the attendance has been extremely strong. In fact, we had 492 people register for this event. Each one, we've tried to really take a different angle. The last one was about the view of the millennials. We had one where we had Gary Locke talk about the government experience. We had, then heads of 3 major nonprofits talk about what it looks like from their point of view in terms of what's being done, et cetera. So the whole idea is this is a topic that is very complex. It covers a lot of different angles, but the overall objective here is to, one, help people understand the issues, perhaps get some advice or lessons, but also themselves be involved with organizations that are trying to make a difference. I think that today is a special one because it's this first one we've gotten 2 very well-known academics who have been studying and publishing on this issue. So this is the first one where we have people who have really looked at it from the academic side and written some very powerful books and articles about this issue. I think the most important thing about this initiative is Committee 100 did not invent this topic, or we weren't the first to try to help in this topic, but we see our role as really contributing to the already significant efforts of organizations and individuals who've been tackling this issue for a long time. I think the two panelists that we have today, Jennifer Lee is a professor at Columbia University and has had some nice new things happen recently at the university, right? And has authored a number of award-winning books, including the Asian American Achievement Paradox and also the Diversity Paradox. Karthick Ramakrishnan is a professor at the University of California, Riverside, and he has written very, very heavily on immigration, including his 2 most recent books, Framing Immigrants and The New Immigration Federalism. But he also directs the National Asian American Survey and is a founder of aapidata.com, which, interesting enough, publishes demographic data and policy research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Both of our panelists publish regularly, but they're also quoted frequently, and they have contributed many articles to leading publications. The last thing I want to say is the Committee 100 is a unique organization. Many of you know of it, but it basically was founded 31 years ago by I.M. Pei, Yo-Yo Ma, Oscar Tang, Shirley Young, Henry Tang, et cetera, really for the purpose of two missions. One is to help the Chinese American community on issues related to discrimination, achievement, et cetera. And this particular program fits into that. And the other is just as difficult, is how do you create better information in a nonpartisan way to help in the relationship and understanding between China and the US, which of course has become an even bigger problem than it ever has been. The last thing I want to say is that this is a 1-hour webcast. I'm going to finish my introduction shortly, but we're going to spend the first 30 to 40 minutes in a fireside chat format where I'm going to act as a moderator and direct Jennifer and Karthick through a set of sort of topics that we'd agreed to talk about. And then we're going to make sure that we leave at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions from you in the audience. And there are 2 ways you can ask a question. There's the Q&A function where you can type in your question, and there's also the chat function. So either way, we're going to be able to read your question and we'll be able to read them to the audience and hopefully provide you with some interesting answers. So with that, what I would like to do is really turn it over briefly to both of our panelists, and I'd like each one really just to talk about their background and the things in their background that they think are really important for the topic that we're discussing today. So we'll just start with Jennifer.
Oh, I was going to let Karthik lead.
Oh, no. He talks very fast, so we'll let you go first.
Okay, first I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. It is August, and I'm sure many of you have other things to do, and we really appreciate this attendance. And also thank Peter for organizing a number of these series, which have been really informative and has helped create a nice community, in my view. And it was terrific to hear of different experiences of Asian American professionals, but also hear the questions that came from the audience members. So Peter, thank you for organizing this forum and being so committed to it, even during the summer. I just want to say I am a professor at Columbia. How I became a professor is not terribly surprising because my father is a professor. And as a sociologist, one thing that is very clear is that your level of education and your level of occupational attainment is very closely tied to that of your parents. So if your parents have a college degree, if your parents have a graduate degree, it's very likely that you will follow in their footsteps. I became interested in sociology because I wound up taking a class as an undergraduate, also at Columbia, and was really fascinated by this idea that we can study patterns of behavior and trying to understand why certain patterns continue to emerge. Why do we see certain kinds of hierarchies emerge along the lines of race, along the lines of gender, immigrant status? And that became very, very fascinating for me, both as a woman, as an Asian American, as a child of immigrants, and as an immigrant myself. I decided to pursue a PhD in sociology. In part, I have to say, it wasn't this well-laid plan like many of the graduate students whose applications I read. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do with my life, and I didn't want to go to business school or law school. And I majored in sociology as an undergrad, so my father just gently nudged and suggested I apply to PhD programs. I applied to one, Columbia, I got in, and it was there that I started to really develop interests in the study of inequality, racial and ethnic inequality, immigration, the patterns of second generation attainment, and really trying to understand why do we see differences, how are systematic processes and cultures continuing to reproduce in certain ways that leave certain statuses as they are. So that is very, very general, but I figure we'll get more specific later. And I thought I would turn it over to Karthik, who I also have to thank for reining me in some ways and making me a more public sociologist. I think one of the things he's always said is that I'm really geeky and nerdy. And I was really afraid to talk outside of an academic audience for a very long time. And it was with Karthik, I wrote my first op-ed and started to realize that as academics, I think we have the privilege and we should use that privilege and as a voice to reach a broader audience with our research. So hats off to Karthik, and him.
No, and in fact, the key is to have an impact, not just in your academic community, but to the world, the world or larger world. So I think the kinds of things that you've written, the two of you have written, and op-eds are really, really what you should be doing, right? Use your knowledge and perspectives to have an impact. Okay. So Karthik, I'll turn to you.
Sure. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jennifer, and especially for that shout out as well. One of the things you'll know about me, I think I'm less of a fast talker now. I grew up in the Northeast, so I think I used to talk faster than I do now. But I think fast in a lot of ways. Also, part of my research involves framing and messaging, and I'm always playing around with thoughts and ideas in my head. And so one of the things I just kind of jotted down right now, when you asked about this, Peter, and talk about kind of personally what brought you to this, you hear that expression, the personal is political. I think perfect for this would be the personal is professional, right? And I think often when we think about our professional lives and how we got made the way they do, usually there's just a narrative that is very kind of by the books, kind of like, when I was 8, I always knew I wanted to do this, right? And it was usually just kind of very kind of on topic and on brand. But I think it's good for us to introspect a bit. I've had some chance to do this. I think the first time I did it, so in addition to being a professor, I'm on the board of the California Endowment. And when the headhunter interviewed me, that was the first time. I mean, it was a long interview. I almost want to say it was a 2-hour long interview. And it went back to my childhood days. And so I'm just going to start with that. So where does it begin? It begins with me being an immigrant. I was born in India. I was there till I was 10 years old. My dad is not a professor, but he's an engineer. And so there's different, and these kind of backgrounds matter. He was looking to he was going to be changing jobs. What's also interesting and important, I think, and you see this in terms of the legacy of our immigration laws, right? When you look at the second generation, the children of immigrants, you won't find many second gen people that are older than 50 or older than 55 right now. And that's just a powerful legacy of our racist immigration laws, right? So that's something that's just really interesting to see, that when Jennifer went to college and I went to college, we were among people that were kind of on the leading edge of the second generation Asian immigrant population. But I'm not a second generation immigrant. I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant, meaning that I immigrated when I was 10. I actually went to Canada first before coming to the US. And I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in a suburb of, it's not even a suburb of Boston. In the Northeast, if you're an hour away from Boston, that's not considered a suburb. In California, it would be considered a suburb of LA, right? So I grew up in a relatively white, conservative part of Massachusetts, in central Massachusetts. I wrote about that a little bit in a piece for CNN, because while I generally felt welcome, there were flashpoints when things, I was the editor of my school newspaper. So I was not your stereotype of a quiet immigrant. I think even among Asians, the stereotype of the quiet Asian immigrant, I don't know that many South Asians that are quiet. And we can talk about more of that later in terms of what some of these, I don't want to necessarily say cultural differences, but at least some of these differences that map out, I think, by national origin that we see. So I was always kind of a relatively weird one, I think, compared to other Asian Americans that I met at college. So I went to Brown University. Brown, then as it is now, is a place where there's a lot of free thinking and free expression. Not so much among the Asian American population. You have a lot of pre-professionals, right? And people who are like the kids, especially Asian Americans and Indian Americans in particular, kids who are like the children of doctors who knew from early on that they were also going to become doctors. And they had to take all of these prerequisites, and they had this very defined path. I started off as a religious studies major. I still remember someone from my community who couldn't believe that I was majoring in religion. And literally what he said was, these are all good hobbies. When are you going to get serious, right? And so but I've always, I think, gone against the grain. But at the same time, it becomes challenging when you're trying to forge your own path and you don't see that many role models who are on your path. So I started off as a religion major and then shifted to international relations and then to politics. One thing I will say, if I had to make sense of all the ways I've evolved over time, it's actually trying to make sense of my own experience. The reason why I was a religious studies major was I remember going to the library a lot. So we were middle class for sure. A lot of people think they were middle class. We were definitely middle class. My dad was an engineer. He moved relatively late in his career. We had to start not from scratch, but we didn't have that much. So I went to the public library a lot and just read a lot. And I remember reading about all these things about Hinduism. that my parents never told me. What we learned was a very kind of stodgy and kind of Victorian reinterpretation of Hinduism. And I remember reading all these things and I was like, wow, it's really fascinating. So I started doing that, and then over time got interested in religion and politics. So I got interested in political science. One final thing I'll say, and Peter, please cut me off at any point, because I might be getting long-winded.
We're still waiting to hear how this got into this issue of career ceilings, but we're very patient.
Okay. All right. So I think, okay, so the thing is this, I didn't have much in the way of role models, right? So in many ways, I think for a lot of us doing social science work, people would think, and I actually remember this, and some of this we can talk about it later on. There were these like minority fellowship programs, and I applied to them, and I remember writing in my application, yes, there are a lot of Asians in academia, but I don't know that many Asian political scientists or Asians doing the work that I'm interested in doing. I didn't end up getting that particular fellowship, but it was all right. I've done okay, right? I mean, I went to Brown, I went to Princeton for grad school. I have a job that I love, and the kind of impact that I think that our work is having nationally, it's amazing. One kind of key point I think that was important for me in terms of doing this public engagement was, I remember getting a paper accepted to the American Political Science Association. It is the, it's the national association. It's very competitive, difficult for grad students to get their papers accepted. I was so excited. My paper was on immigrant voting behavior. And this will come in later on when we talk about career ceilings. And I remember seeing who else was on the panel. I was super excited. These were all people that I had cited, and they've been like producing in this field for such a long time. I didn't pay attention to the fact that it was a Thursday 8 a.m. panel. So here I am, just like bushy-tailed, bright-eyed, show up, and there are 5 people in the audience. And I was like, wow.
Yeah, but they were the right 5 people, Karthick.
They were, but
Yeah.
it's like, no, but I said, you know what, this is not the way I want to have impact.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And so that's really then, I think, has explained the rest of my trajectory, in which for me, it doesn't matter what university you're in, doesn't matter what role you have. I actually worked at a think tank before I came to UCR because I was actually disillusioned with academia because it was so insular. It was so ivory tower. Yet all of this research that was just bottled up among a small group of experts. Now I know among Asian Americans, and from what I've heard from people say, especially among Chinese Americans, professors are very, very high in the pecking order. But what's interesting is that in American society, not as much, right? There are all these stereotypes about professors just being too insular. So for me, public impact, community impact, policy impact has been a motivating factor for as long as I can remember.
So let me with that, let's get on to our topic here. And by the way, both my parents are professors, and I will tell you, if you're Chinese American and your parents are professors, it's a challenge. It's a challenge because they just want you to be professors. So let's start out. Now, one of the things that we've learned in the previous 6 webinars is lots of different interpretations about what the challenges are and why, right? And I think the 3 of us, we had kind of a dry run where we talked a little bit about the issues. And I think one of the things came out is that both of you have done a lot of thinking about what are the actual rules as opposed to what the rules are perceived and so forth. So let me start out, and we'll start with Jennifer and just say, from your perspective, what do you think the rules appear to be to people in terms of, the obstacle of how you get through obstacles and what the obstacles are versus the kind of the work that you've done, what appear to be the real rules and what the real drivers are from the work that you've done?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I have to put on my sociology hat here. And before I go into that question, and I won't model myself after Karthick, who gave a novella, but I did want to mention, as a sociologist, one of the things we're very interested in is thinking about patterns of behavior. And so I think one of the biggest misconceptions about the rules of any game is that the United States is a meritocracy, that those who work hard get ahead. And it's based on talent, effort, and that is it. I would say that there have been a number of studies from sociologists that show consistently that even when you present employers with the same resume and you just change a name, so you change the gender of the person, you change the racial status of the person, or you change the parental characteristics of the person, you see different outcomes in terms of who gets called back, who gets an offer, and the starting salary. So research has consistently shown that, for instance, mothers, just being a mother leads employers and other people to believe that you'll be less competent at work, less committed at work. Mothers are offered lower starting salaries than women who don't have children. Fathers, on the other hand, get a boost. They're perceived as extremely competent, extremely committed, and they will be offered higher starting salaries than women. And these mothers, and this is controlling for all the characteristics that it's on a resume except changing parental status. So this is the thing, this is the kind of research that I draw on when I think about what are the rules of the game. You can do everything that you think is correct and have a different outcome, in large part because of your status characteristics. And so
Does this,
it's very important.
do the studies, have they done it to see whether having an Asian American name or whatever, do those studies show that the same kind of problem?
Yeah, actually, I was doing some research on this. I haven't seen that. What I've seen, I've looked at some studies of, for instance, teaching evaluations of professors. So when you give students syllabi, for instance, the same exact syllabi from a white professor and an Asian professor, they will perceive both professors as competent, but they'll automatically perceive the Asian professor as less socially skilled.
Mm-hmm.
Will perceive Black professors with the same syllabus as less competent. So I mention all of this because the whole point of this is what are the rules of the game. And one of the things I want to for as a sociologist is that we tend to think that these are individualistic processes and choices and actions that we can do that will change an outcome. Part of that is true. I'm not saying that we don't have agency, but I do think it's important that we think about the structures that in place that continue to advantage certain groups and disadvantage other groups.
And the research you do and the writing you've done, can you point to a certain set of either rules or obstacles that particularly affect Asian Americans in terms of their success?
Yeah, so I would say there are a couple of different things. So in the book that I wrote with my colleague Min Zhou, The Asian American Achievement Paradox, one of the things we found is that Asians actually excel in education. They do very well in getting into colleges. They do very well in high school. So just to give you an example, Harvard, which is still fighting the affirmative action case, about 25% of the entering class is Asian American. Yet Asian Americans are only about 6% of the US population. So we're overrepresented as a percentage of our population in a place like Harvard. But if you look at the faculty, and this is what Karthick was getting at, only 11% of Harvard's tenured faculty are Asian. And if you look at that by gender, there's a stark gender divide. So of that 11%, 8% are men, 3% are women. So one of the things I joke about is that the thing about Crazy Rich Asians is the idea that you would be taught by someone who looks like Constance Wu, right? I mean, it's just, there are just very few of us. By far, the majority of professors are white male, white and of that male. And so this gets to the career ceiling. I know that you had a number of speakers come on and talk about barriers in technology companies, in law, but even in the domain of education where Asian Americans are excelling as students, we are not excelling at the professorial level to tenure. to other leadership positions. Only 2% of university presidents are Asian. So again, these are just some numbers to indicate that you excel in
But it
one.
does show, but it basically shows what the trend is, which is, I guess what you're saying
Yes.
is, in general, the early stages of education entry are not a problem, but depending upon the profession, as you as you advance, particularly as you said in academic, there's a serious issue. Karthik, you wanted to talk. I know you wanted to talk about what the rules and are and what so forth. So, what do you perceive? Maybe a few examples of the rules, and particularly if you could focus on ones that maybe are not so obvious to the people in the audience, because there's some that everyone knows, right? But about personalities and so forth. But are there some that really come out as maybe not so obvious to people, but actually very important?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I mean, what I want to lift up is two things, actually. So I think this will be a way to answer that question. And maybe part of my bias is because I'm a political scientist, right? And I come at it thinking about civic engagement. And you might ask, why am I bringing civic engagement into a conversation about career glass ceilings or bamboo ceilings, whatever you want to call it? I'm bringing it up because I think it could be part of a solution, but it might also be part of the same underlying problem. But the first thing I want to say is this. I think both Jennifer and I, occasionally you'll see us kind of disagreeing, maybe kind of pulling on different sides. How much of it is the kind of sociologist saying, how much of it is structure versus agency or structure versus culture, right? I'm going to be leaning a little bit more on the cultural side today, and I think just more generally. And this is kind of pushing back, even as people push back on the battle hymn of the tiger mother. I mean, we know that there are certain truths that book had. And I say this as someone, as an immigrant, if you talk to my kids are still in elementary school. Well, one of them is graduating from elementary school, graduated from there this year.
They're not applying early admission to Brown, no?
They're not. They're not.
Gosh, I'm very disappointed to hear that.
Yeah, but they probably think of me as a tiger dad. I'm like a half tiger dad, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that, so we can see those truths, right, in terms of very high expectations in terms of academic performance. But I am not a tiger parent in the sense of trying to tell them that the pathway to success is to get good grades and do these activities and really, really excel in violin or piano. I think, by the way, again, I think this is more of an East Asian thing than a South Asian thing. I'm just going to kind of bring some of that back, right? And so part of it might be English proficiency, may be part of it. Part of it might also be prior experience with democracy. And also the multi-ethnic nature of India and South Asia. There's just
let me add there about there, because we're fortunate to have you, a South Asian, right? And Jennifer, who's East Asian. The question, this has come up before, but we haven't had the privilege of having, a prominent academic who's from South Asia. Draw the distinction that you see in the behavior and the rules between South Asians and East Asians. And the reason why I mention is the data really shows there's a real difference in how they've succeeded in corporate life, in boards, the number of CEOs, et cetera. And so maybe you can, and it's partly, you have a personal perspective as well. Any comment on why there appears to be a difference, as because do they have different set of obstacles or just a different cultural aspect?
Absolutely. And this is kind of one of the reasons why I and Jennifer have been talking about writing a book. And for me, it actually came up, one of the C100, I believe Buck G is a C100 member, is that right? But Buck G was part of a panel in San Francisco that where you also had M.R. Rangasamy, both are in Silicon Valley, and they had this conversation, especially in Silicon Valley. South Asians seem to be getting much farther ahead than than East Asians, especially Chinese Americans.
And why do you think so?
No,
I
exactly.
I know Buck's point of view because he was a speaker in the first panel, so I know his view. So
Yeah.
what's your view, though?
So my view, and I'll go back to this. This is where it comes back to civic engagement. I remember talking to Norm Mineta, and he talked about how exceptional it was for him to run for office. And he said, in Asian culture, there are different variations of this expression, but the nail that sticks out gets hammered in, right? So you're not encouraged to express yourself, to speak up, right? You're just there to kind of just go with the flow and find other ways to navigate these structures. And I would say that's very much part of East Asian cultures. That maybe it's different with Korea. So we can get into some of that a little bit, but especially in Chinese culture, like that is a very, very strong norm. Confucian culture, that you're supposed to respect elders, respect authority, know your place, maybe find subtle ways to navigate things, but don't speak up and speak out.
And you
South
feel
Asian,
that's different for South Asians?
Oh yeah. How many South Asian friends do you have that?
I have a lot of South Asian friends.
And they're not quiet people.
No, and we've talked about this issue because a number of them are CEOs and so forth. So we talk about this issue. So you feel that part of it is just cultural, right?
Part of it is cultural. I also think experience with democracy makes a difference too. India's democracy is a very messy kind of democracy. And it's also very multi-ethnic. So I think Satya Nadella, in one of the interviews, he's a CEO of Microsoft, he said, when you're going up the corporate ladder in India, you get assigned to different places in India. You work with people from different religions, different languages, different caste backgrounds, and you learn very quickly how to adapt. India also has gotten colonized in multiple ways over time. So Indians know quite well how to read how the rules of the game are, who's in power, how to understand those rules, and to succeed in that system. So I think it goes very deep.
Let's get back to the overall theme, all right? And that is rules and how to challenge them and so forth. So I'm going to ask both of you to say, look, you got to assume that everyone in the audience really has read a lot on this issue and aware of the data. Certainly if they watched some of the previous webcasts, they would have been exposed to the experts who talked about this. So what I wanted to do is coax out some more controversial opinions from you about what are the unconventional ways to break the rules to succeed, right? I don't want the conventional one to say, okay, form mentorships and so forth. I don't want to get the same old stuff from the two of you. I want to hear, what do you think are some methods to break the rules that are just not commonly known, right? That will help the people in the audience succeed in whatever profession they're trying to succeed. Okay, Jennifer, do you have a comment?
Yes. Well, first I have to push back on Karthik a bit, and he'll be surprised by this in the sense that I think Karthik, we go back and forth. So this is not the first time we're going to go back and forth. I think one of the things I really want to challenge is this idea that in order to succeed, and even with you here, in order to succeed and be to get promoted to managerial or executive positions, you have to be loud, or you have to be vocal. You have to speak up all the time. I mean, I think, of course, you want to voice your opinion, you want to make your opinion known. But when I look around at different types of leaders, one of the things I find is that oftentimes we think leaders should take on a particularly male persona, loud, verbal, speaking oftentimes without thinking, just speaking. And so one of the things I think is important to think about is, are there other leadership models that defy that? And absolutely there are. There are a number, I mean, if you look at, just to bring in COVID-19, some of the female leaders around the world are doing a much better job of containing the virus than a lot of the male leaders. So let's put that out there.
So with regard to Asian Americans though, do you feel that, how does that tie into Asian American success or lack of success, or difference between groups?
I think my point is here is that I think when we think about how should Asian Americans adopt a particular style to look more like someone else in order to succeed, I think that's the wrong question. And again, this is my sociologist hat, but this is also me speaking from personal experience. I think it's about, okay, when you want to understand how to move ahead, and I do that by looking at models of who's gotten where and what do I want and how do I get there. But those models need not be Asian American. They need not even be women. Once I'm in a position where I'm able to make influential decisions, putting myself on certain committees, I'm consistently challenging certain ideas of what leadership looks like, what good scholarship looks like. That we are not all going to look the same on paper. And so not to privilege a particular norm. So I think I'm much more about challenging this underlying assumption that there is one leadership style or there's one way to get ahead. I think there are many ways to get ahead, but I think there is a responsibility for those who do get ahead to make sure that they're opening opportunities for others.
So if I pull it back to the Asian American group, so are what you're trying to say is that this idea that if you're more aggressive and outspoken, that'll be a key to success, so forth. So you're saying that's not necessarily true.
Not at all. I mean, I think if you see Karthick and me, even just in this webinar, you see our personalities are quite different.
Well, you're all very soft-spoken and timid. So
this is the thing that I've been pushing back on. I mean, if I think of, but I understand also as a woman and as an Asian American female, I'm perceived in certain ways before I even open my mouth, as soon as I enter the door. I understand that, but at the same time, I don't feel like I have to act like some of my brash male colleagues in order to be heard, in order to be influential, in order to make strong decisions or to have influence, whether it's at the university.
Okay, but that's go. I get that, but that's not what I'm saying, right? So this is the thing I would say.
All South Asians are loud, Karthick.
I take liberties. This is like, I will say things for shock value, right? I mean, I know plenty of South Asians.
But as a sociologist, I can't let that fly.
Okay, but the thing I wanted to say on this is, absolutely we should recognize the way race privilege, gender privilege, straight privilege, upper class privilege. I'm really fascinated. I want to read this book about the US having a caste system, right? I think there are all these ways in which absolutely there's a very kind of narrow view of what that looks like. I think where Jennifer and I kind of tug on two things is you need to change the rules of the game, but in the meantime, you also need to, at the very least, there's value to understanding how the game is truly played, as opposed to the kind of what is written down, which might have no bearing on the reality of how the rules actually operate, right? The couple of things I would say in terms of advice that I would give, and this is totally non-traditional advice, right? And then I'll get back to something that may be more traditional, but vote. Write to your elected officials, volunteer, get on boards, engage in philanthropy. Now you might say, what the heck does any of this have to do with you not stalling out in middle management? Well, what it shows you is this. You might not be seen as leadership. People might just take a look at you. I mean, these kind of cues matter. It's not what you say, it's not what you do. People will look at you and they see how you operate in the space, and they might say, that doesn't look like leadership material to me. He or she does not look like leadership material. Well, there's a way that you can show that you're a leader by finding those opportunities outside of the workplace.
Yeah.
And
I think that's
maybe then you quit. Maybe your firm does not truly recognize who you are, and then you go somewhere else and show and do what you're passionate about. So one is civic engagement. There are all sorts of benefits that accrue from civic engagement. And the more you do that, the more power you'll have within the organization. Second thing I'll say is take risks, right? And you can take risks and without being loud and brash, but take risks. Be ready to leave your job. Be ready to take those risks. Be ready to have whatever your style is, to give feedback to your supervisor or in a meeting where you want to kind of assert your idea and to have that be recognized. There's not enough risk taking among Asian Americans. I know that's a broad statement, but in general, there's not enough risk taking, and we know that with risk come the potential for failure, but the potential reward is also much higher.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to some of the questions that people ask. There are quite a few, and let me choose some, and they're actually very interesting questions. So the first one is from Jimmy T, and he said, we're noticing that Asians hit a ceiling and can't get the top, because that's a fact, right? Any thoughts on strategies to break through? That's the first question, which I think both of you have commented on, but you might want to comment more. But the other is kind of a little bit of a tricky question, and is this a new norm in light of increased and necessary focus on African American achievements? So this is this tug of war between African American achievements, et cetera, and Asians achieving. So any thoughts on this? It's kind of an interesting question, right? Jennifer, do you have a comment?
I'll take the first part because Karthik said his piece about engagement, and I think and maybe I'll just leave the second part to Karthik and add on if he. I did want to say another thing that I think is important is we think about networking as completely this instrumental activity. One of the things I want to focus on in terms of getting ahead and moving past the professional ranks is one thing that's very important to me that I don't think I even thought about consciously is the idea of relationship building. And so building relationships, figuring out who your allies are, and they don't have to be mentors necessarily, but who are your allies who would support you, and thinking about building those relationships and not in just a one-way street. Relationships are not unidirectional. So the more I think you become invested in certain things that matter to you, the bigger the payoff, and the more then those people will be willing to fight for you and invest in you. So for me, if I think about one of the strategies or one of the unwritten rules, we think about it's about productivity, all of these other things, but there are a number of, I think, benefits that come to building relationships, not just thinking so strategically, but building relationships with people who have similar commitments and passions that you do, who are willing to go to bat for you, who are willing to invest in you, as an employee, as a student, as a junior professor, whatever that is.
On the second question from Jimmy T, I'm not the panelist, but I want to make one following observation, particularly since this has been an issue that has been thought through by the Committee 100, which is it's not a win-lose between African Americans or Jews or Asian Americans. In fact, if you go back, you'll find that some of the strongest supporters of Asian American rights at different parts in history have been Jewish Americans or Black, or Black African Americans, or so forth. So I think it's not either or. I think it's one of those things where we all share the same kinds of problems, not exactly the same, but share the same problems. And I think it's very important to say helping others, ethnic groups, is also a way to help yourself, right? Because we have a shared problem. And this is one of the things that, we've given a lot of thought to, which actually leads to the second question, just as, and it's implied, this is how do you got to think about this age of Black Lives Matter in terms of Asian American gaining visibility? And I guess I'm saying it's not a win-lose, necessarily, but this is a question to the panelists. Go ahead, Karthick.
I would say it's not only is it not win-lose, I think we should, when you say we share a common problem, I think we should name it, and that problem is white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
It might sound, saying that now sounds less radical than it might have been 6 months ago or a year ago, but I think more and more people have that analysis now. And the thing I would say personally, as someone who's on a foundation board, I'm on the board of the California Endowment, we just made a 10-year, $225 million commitment to Black-led organizations. I here in the Inland Empire, after the murder of George Floyd, not only wrote a piece of my mind in terms of why we need to invest in Black communities, but really our center has done a lot of work supporting Black-led organizations. And it's not just to make sure that we are there for other communities. We need to recognize, the massive debt we owe Black communities. Many of us will not have been in this country. We would not have had the Immigration Act, the liberalization of the Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965 without the Civil Rights Movement. It just would not have happened. We would have continued to have had Asian restrictions without that struggle. Thing I would add is also now, especially in a region like ours, I'm in the Inland Empire, this is east of LA. The Black population is, I believe, about 7% of the resident population. The Latino population is actually a majority in this region. So as someone who invests in organizations, people might say, and we helped create a Black equity fund with a $5 million goal over 2 years. Why is it important? Not only do we need to care about our Black communities, but our Black-led organizations, they've been able to change systems that benefit the rest of us. They pushed through a resolution in San Bernardino County, one of the most conservative counties in California, to declare racism a public health crisis. And it's not just Black people that are going to benefit from that. Latinos are going to benefit from that. Asians are going to benefit from that. The county is going to be collecting more data on all racial groups, as well as there's going to be some added emphasis to try to get detailed health information on Asian and Pacific Islander groups. So Black Lives Matter, not just because it's the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do for Asian Americans if we're going to combat white supremacy and discrimination.
Yeah. Here's one question. And that is, it's specific to the current environment. You know, the current environment about xenophobia, anti-immigrant, so forth. You know, how do we deal with that? You know, that current heightened phenomenon in terms of this issue of how to succeed in your careers, et cetera. So, you know, what do you have to do this different, or is it just plain harder, right? Jennifer?
Here I would.
This is a question from Carson.
Oh, for Karthik?
Carson.
Oh,
the question comes from Carson. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, hi Carson. I actually wanted to first echo what Karthik said, is that we need to be politically involved. One of the kind of anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia, it's not just about Trump, but Trump has certainly magnified it and has certainly inflamed certain kinds of sentiments among certain kinds of populations. I do think one of the things, I think that this has been a valuable lesson for us as Asian Americans to understand that something as simple as naming a virus and attributing it to a certain region or racializing it shows the precariousness of our racial status. That you could live, as John Cho, the actor, had written in a LA Times op-ed, that you can live in some ways your life as a raceless individual and in some ways benefit from the privilege of your class status, your occupational status. And it takes something like this to make you realize how precarious your racial status is. And so when we think about Black Lives Matter, for instance, it benefits all of us, absolutely, but it also lays bare the precariousness of race of non-whites in the United States. And so I think one of the things I've tried to argue is that when we think about, and this ties into the earlier question about Black Lives Matter, and I wanted to tie it in a bit with affirmative action, which Karthik and I have written about quite a bit, is I think this moment should show Asian Americans that race affects everyday experiences. If we want to magnify this, how might it differently affect your life chances over the life course? And this is what affirmative action is about. It's not about giving privileges to different groups. It's really about taking a holistic approach to your life experiences and then weighing that in terms of university admissions, in terms of promotions. As we're here talking about career ceilings, where Asian Americans would benefit most in terms of from affirmative action is in the workplace, where we're butting against certain kinds of biases and certain kinds of assumptions about what we're capable of and what a leader looks like.
Well, I have a special question here from actually a very special person, Henry Tang. Henry Tang was one of the founders of the Committee 100 and is one of the governors. And he is asking an interesting historical question, which is, can you comment on the relationship between the 1882 Exclusion Act, which was really a serious issue that lasted for decades, and its impact on Asian Americans and their success in the generations during the next 140 years. And it's an interesting question because the Exclusion Act really took so many rights away from Asian Americans and so forth for a really long time, right? Regardless of the ethnicity. So it's a Chinese exclusion. So any comments on that? Do you feel that had any historical impact? Karthik?
Yeah, and I'll also plug my book that's coming out in the end of September, early October. It's called Citizenship Reimagined. And the reason why I'm going to plug that is that so many of us know about the 1882 Exclusion Act, but this book we look at state citizenship, and it's not just state citizenship in a liberal or progressive direction, but also in what we call regressive state citizenship. And if you talk about anti-Chinese laws and sentiment, California was the pioneer. It did it almost as soon as the state got founded. So it started implementing anti-Chinese laws as well as laws against other Asian immigrants. But it did it right after the gold rush. And what you saw with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was actually the nationalization of California's racist policies against Chinese, right? In fact, in 1879, they revised their constitution and added a clause that literally says the Chinese, right? And prevented them from public employment and really tried to set them back economically and socially as far back as possible. There are absolutely major legacy effects still from the Chinese Exclusion Act, but also for other Asian exclusion that followed. I'll say something that might be a little bit controversial. No surprise, right? I think when you look at things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's emblematic of what you see in other parts of the world where they talk about so-called middleman minorities, right? Of minorities, Chinese as well as Indians, either through colonialism or other kinds of processes, were in this position where they have some amount of economic privilege. They're shown to be superior than a lower income racialized population, and somehow they owe their success, or at least their place, to the acceptance of whites that are in a higher political power. I mean, we've seen this kind of phenomenon elsewhere. To me, this actually shows the danger of what happens if you think of success or if your role is purely an economic one, because then you are not seen as having anything meaningful to say or contribute to society, and you get resentment from those that are in more disadvantaged populations, as well as kind of an arm's length relationship and lack of concern among those in power. So hopefully it's not controversial, because I don't want to say that we are responsible for the kind of harms that come to us, but I think again, it's part of understanding the rules of the game. understand that civic engagement, political engagement, because a lot of people, when I did my dissertation work in 2000, when I went around the country and talking to people, they said, you know, we are just trying to get ahead economically. We don't have time for politics. We don't have time to get involved. And the answer is, you know what happens when you don't get involved? It's the kind of, it's this kind of semi-snarky expression, right? If you don't get involved, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But there's some truth.
But you know, and I guess it is definitely true that Asian Americans generally are not as politically active relative to their population. Now, whether becoming more politically active would certainly help the representation of the group. Whether it will help you individually in your careers is a harder question, right? I guess if you became president of the United States, probably you would get a promotion, right?
It's not a hard question at all to me, Peter, but we can talk about that later.
Now, there's one very interesting question here, and I think you'll either consider it to be kind of rude or not, I don't know. And it's from an anonymous attendee. It says, Western versus Eastern names. Do you think it's better to name your child with a Western name than an Eastern name? Interesting, very direct question, right? Jennifer.
I always go back to what studies show and what research shows. So rather than just voicing an opinion, I will say that when in sociological studies of people who have emailed professors, for instance, using all different kinds of names, it will not surprise many people that the professors are least likely to respond to Asians with foreign sounding names. So that is just one way, I think, to show the ways in which bias operates. But that said, I come back to something that I think about oftentimes, that Asians in the United States, on average, and I know there's tremendous variation in the Asian American population, and that's something that Karthik and I underscore all the time, but Asians on average are more highly educated than other immigrant groups, and certainly more highly educated than native-born whites and blacks on average.
I think she's frozen.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All
that
right.
class status protect.
There we go. You just froze. Now you're unfrozen. Okay. We have the last 2 minutes.
One quick thing I'll say about the names.
No.
Wait. One quick thing about the names. No. I have to say something about the names. It's absolutely true, and this is where I would toggle back, right? So, a lot of Indians have very distinctive names, whereas a lot of East Asians Christianize their names or are Christian themselves. But this is what it shows you, that even if those things are true, this is where I would actually be back on Jennifer's side. We have to change the systems. We have to make it so things like a name is not consequential. But I have to think about this when naming my kids. I was not going to give my kids Christian names just to make their life easier. They're going to be stronger individuals for it, but it takes a lot of love and support, and to show them how the rules of the game work, and also how to be able to self-advocate and to have that really strong sense of love and pride in a society, not only about white supremacy, but about colonialism, Christianity, all of that stuff, to be able to pierce through and to have that real sense of solidity there.
But it's really a difficult personal decision in the end, right? Because it's on one hand preserving your ethnic culture with your kids and so forth. On the other hand, acknowledging that society is not fair, right? And that is a tough. There's no simple answer to that one. So with the last 1 minute we have, I'm going to ask each of you the following. Use one word that you would, if you only have one word that you can say to someone in the audience with regard to your advice about succeeding in the current, with the, career ceilings, what's that word? So we'll, either one of you, but you got one word, or maybe 1.5 words, because I think Karthik talked about 1.5, right? Jennifer, one word. You got someone says, I want some advice. What's the one word you would say?
I would say two. I can have two. One is allyship, thinking about who your allies are, and that's not just those above you, but those at your level and those who might not have those in subordinate positions, but also understanding your purpose. And if you want to get ahead, really asking yourself why, you know, so.
Okay. So purpose, what's the
Yes.
purpose? Right.
What's the purpose? It's a very tough question.
Okay, and Karthik, your 1 word or 1.5 words?
One word is vote. But it means get involved. The kind of things, the key is this: pro-social behavior is actually beneficial for you individually. So I think this notion I'd like to think of is a kind of enlightened self-interest. It is not a selfish interest, but pro-social behavior, civic engagement. You will be amazed what it actually does to your life and your career trajectory.
Now, we have just proven that 2 academics are unable to come up with 1 word. Karthik, I think yours was like at 37 or something like that, but we won't hold it against you. But I have the last word, which is I want to really thank the 2 panelists. I think each of these webcasts, we try to have different perspectives and so forth, and having the perspective of 2 panelists, both are academics, both who've written heavily in this area and written op-eds. I want to thank you both, and I hope all the audience who joined appreciate it as well. And so thank you all, and I thank the audience for participating, and in particular for asking these very good, thoughtful, and sometimes pithy questions. So thank you all, and good night.
Hi, thank you.